Is this what justice looks like to you?
Marcus Grant's voice was calm, but carried a weight of betrayal, cutting through the crisp morning air as the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. His face was forced down against the unforgiving pavement, the rough concrete scraping his cheek. Despite the physical pain, Marcus focused on staying composed, fighting the surge of humiliation and anger boiling in his chest. This wasn't just about him. It was about a lifetime of lessons his father had drilled into him: how to act when faced with law enforcement, how to keep calm even when every fiber of his being was screaming in protest. Officer Bradley loomed over him, his hand pressing firmly into Marcus's back. "Stay down," he barked, his tone thick with authority and disdain. Next to him, Officer Thompson watched with his hand resting on his holster, eyes scanning the growing crowd. Marcus, dressed in his tailored suit, looked nothing like a criminal, but that didn't matter. Not here. Not now. His every movement was a perceived threat, every breath a potential escalation. Around them, bystanders began to gather. Mrs. Harriet Lewis, watching in horror from her balcony, shouted,
"What are you doing to him? He hasn't done anything wrong."
Her voice cracked with desperation, but the officers ignored her, their focus unbroken. A young man nearby pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he recorded the scene. "This is insane," he muttered to his girlfriend, who stood frozen beside him, clutching the leash of their small dog. Marcus tried to steady his breathing, the words of his father echoing in his mind. Stay calm. Stay alive. But even as he obeyed, as he made no sudden movements, the sense of injustice burned in his gut. He hadn't resisted, hadn't done anything but exist in his own neighborhood, and yet here he was, pinned down like a threat. As Officer Bradley tightened the cuffs around his wrists, Marcus lifted his eyes, meeting the gaze of the crowd.
"Remember this,"
he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him.
"This is what justice looks like to them. But it's not over."
And in that moment, with the world watching and recording, Marcus knew that this fight was just beginning. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, take a moment to connect with us. Wherever you are, there's a story unfolding. Give us a glimpse. What's your part of the world like right now? Drop a comment below and let us know. And while you're here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our future stories. We're excited to share this journey with you. Marcus Grant sat in the back of the squad car, the cool metal of the handcuffs digging into his wrists, a painful reminder of the injustice he was enduring. The world outside was a blur of concerned faces and raised voices. The vehicle began to pull away, leaving behind a crowd that had transformed from morning commuters to outraged onlookers. The vibration of his phone in his pocket was a distant echo of normalcy, a silent scream of the life he should have been living, a life now reduced to the harsh confines of a police car. Marcus clenched his jaw, refusing to let any emotion surface. He knew all too well how easily any display of frustration could be twisted into something dangerous. His mind raced, recalling every civil rights case he had fought, every protest he had marched in, and every person who had put their trust in him to make a difference. But now, in this moment, he was just another black man in cuffs. Inside the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center, the air was stale, and the fluorescent lights above flickered with a relentless hum. Officer Bradley and Officer Thompson walked with Marcus down the cold gray hallway, their grip on his arms unyielding. Marcus didn't resist. He kept his head high, his eyes scanning the station. Each step felt heavier than the last, like a march into an uncertain future. In a corner, Lieutenant Emily Carson observed the scene with a growing sense of unease. She had only been with the Evergreen Department for a few months, but already she had witnessed incidents that tested her sense of justice. Something about this arrest didn't sit right with her. Marcus Grant's name felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. What was a well-dressed, composed man like him doing in cuffs, brought in by officers she knew had a tendency to abuse their authority? Marcus was led to the fingerprinting station, where Officer Thompson pushed him roughly toward the machine. Marcus steadied himself, his gaze unwavering. The station was filled with the usual chaos, phones ringing, officers shouting across the room, and the clatter of paperwork. But even amidst the noise, Marcus felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. "Name?" the officer behind the desk asked, barely glancing up from the computer. "Marcus Grant," Marcus replied, his voice steady. The officer paused, typing the name into the system. His eyes flickered with recognition, but he said nothing, his expression carefully neutral. Marcus knew what that pause meant. His name carried weight, and it wouldn't be long before the station realized just who they had arrested. As the process dragged on, Marcus focused on controlling his breathing, a skill honed from years of facing adversity. He thought about his students at Evergreen University, the young, eager minds he had mentored, and how he always taught them that the law was supposed to be a shield, not a weapon. Today, that shield had been stripped away, leaving him vulnerable to a system he knew too well. Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd was only growing. Aisha Robinson had taken charge, her voice commanding and resolute. "We want answers," she called out, a megaphone in hand. "Marcus Grant is a pillar of this community. This cannot stand." The crowd responded with a wave of support, their chants echoing off the concrete walls of the police station. Across from the growing crowd, Dr. Benjamin Howard, a respected professor at Evergreen University and a longtime friend of Marcus, watched with furrowed brows. He had come as soon as he heard, leaving his class in the middle of a lecture. The tension in the air was palpable, and Benjamin knew that this moment was a powder keg waiting to ignite. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, reaching out to local leaders and journalists. This story had to be told, and he would make sure it reached every corner of Evergreen Heights. Inside the station, Lieutenant Carson made her way to her office, her mind racing. She sat at her desk, fingers drumming against the wooden surface, and pulled up Marcus Grant's name on her computer. Her heart sank as she read about his work. A celebrated civil rights attorney, known for taking on cases of police misconduct, a man whose reputation for seeking justice had made him both respected and feared. Carson swallowed hard, a knot forming in her stomach. This was not just another routine arrest. This was a nightmare in the making. "Lieutenant?" Officer Jackson, the young, eager officer who had always shown a genuine desire to make a difference, appeared at her door. His face was flushed and his hands trembled slightly. "I think you should see this," he said, holding up his phone. A video was playing, the one recorded by the young man outside, showing Marcus being manhandled by officers Bradley and Thompson. The image of Marcus being forced to the ground, his face a mask of controlled pain, sent a wave of anger through Carson. "Damn it," Carson muttered, standing up abruptly. She knew she had to act. Ignoring this could mean the end of her career, not to mention the irreparable damage to the department's already shaky reputation. But more than that, it was about doing what was right. She grabbed her jacket and headed toward the holding cells, her heart pounding. In the holding area, Marcus sat on the metal bench, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The cold air bit at his skin, and the walls felt like they were closing in. But he refused to let himself feel powerless. His father's voice echoed in his memory, a constant reminder to stand tall, even in the face of injustice. Marcus lifted his head as the door opened, and Lieutenant Carson walked in, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Grant," she began, her voice professional, but with a hint of uncertainty. "I'm Lieutenant Emily Carson. I need to ask you a few questions." Marcus met her gaze, his eyes steady and unwavering. He knew that this was his moment to tell his story, but he also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. The real battle was only just beginning. Lieutenant Emily Carson's footsteps echoed through the hallways of the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center as she made her way back to her office. Every step was a reminder of the responsibility that now rested heavily on her shoulders. The video Officer Jackson had shown her kept replaying in her mind. Marcus Grant, a respected civil rights attorney, forced to the ground like a common criminal. She clenched her fists, trying to suppress the anger that simmered beneath her composed exterior. This was more than just a bad arrest. It was a threat to the fragile trust between the police and the community. Sitting down at her desk, Carson let out a slow, controlled breath and picked up her phone. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. Dialing Chief Harold Morgan's number, she braced herself for the conversation she knew was coming. "Lieutenant Carson?" Morgan's gruff voice barked on the other end. "I hope you have an explanation for this mess." Carson swallowed hard, choosing her words carefully. "Chief, we've made a grave mistake. Marcus Grant isn't just a high-profile attorney. He's a central figure in several cases against police misconduct. If we don't handle this carefully, the consequences will be catastrophic." There was a heavy pause, and Carson could almost hear the gears turning in Morgan's mind. "You're telling me we've arrested the one man who has the power to tear this department apart?" "Yes, sir," Carson replied, her voice steady. "And there's more. The community is gathering outside the station, led by activists like Aisha Robinson and Dr. Benjamin Howard. It's only a matter of time before this turns into a media circus." Morgan let out a low curse. "Do whatever you have to do to contain this. We can't afford to let this get any worse." Carson hung up, the pressure mounting. She had to think quickly. Rising from her chair, she strode back toward the holding cells. Marcus was still there, sitting upright on the cold metal bench, his expression calm but his eyes alert. He looked up as Carson approached, and for a moment their gazes locked in a silent exchange. One of defiance from Marcus and determination from Carson. "Mr. Grant," Carson said, her voice firm but measured, "I'm working to get to the bottom of this. I need to know exactly what happened." Marcus raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "You mean you're starting to realize this isn't just a simple arrest?" His voice was calm, but there was a bite to his words that cut through the air. Carson wasn't used to being challenged so directly, but she held her ground. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted from the front of the station. The shouts and chants of the crowd had grown louder, and now the unmistakable hum of news cameras had joined the cacophony. Carson's heart sank. The situation was spiraling faster than she could control. Outside, Aisha Robinson stood at the forefront of the crowd, her megaphone raised high. Her voice rang clear and powerful, cutting through the chaos. "We will not be silenced. Marcus Grant is not just a name. He is a voice for all of us who have been ignored, marginalized, and oppressed." The crowd roared in agreement, their signs waving like banners of resistance. Dr. Benjamin Howard stepped forward, his deep, commanding voice adding gravity to the scene. "We demand justice not only for Marcus, but for every person who has been mistreated by a system that is supposed to protect us." In the back of the crowd, Officer Jackson watched with a conflicted expression. He had joined the force with dreams of making a difference, of being a protector of the community. But now, seeing the pain and outrage in the eyes of the people he was sworn to serve, he felt a gnawing sense of guilt. Taking a deep breath, he pushed through the crowd and made his way inside, determined to do something, anything, that could make this right. Back in the holding cell, Marcus could hear the chants from outside. Each word was a reminder that he was not alone, that his community stood with him. But the thought didn't bring comfort. It brought a deep, burning determination. He had fought too long and too hard to let this injustice be just another statistic. Carson opened the cell door, motioning for Marcus to follow. "We're going to talk in my office," she said. Marcus stood, his movements measured, and walked with her down the hallway. The weight of the cuffs still a reminder of how easily things could be taken from him. As they entered Carson's office, Marcus sat across from her, his eyes never leaving hers. "So," he began, "how do you plan to fix this?" Carson didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. "I need to know everything about what you've been working on," she said. "If there's something we're missing, now's the time to lay it out." Marcus studied her, trying to gauge her sincerity. "You think this is just about me?" he said finally. "This is about a system that has failed over and over again. I've been gathering evidence of corruption, of abuses of power that go far beyond just a few bad cops. And today, your officers just added another chapter to that story." Carson's jaw tightened. She knew he was right. "We don't have much time," she admitted. "The chief wants this handled. But the way he's thinking, it won't end well. We need a real solution, one that addresses the root of the problem." Before Marcus could respond, Officer Jackson burst into the office, his face flushed. "Lieutenant, we've got a major problem," he said, breathless. "The crowd outside, it's getting out of control. Reporters are swarming, and there are rumors that more activists are on their way." Carson stood, feeling the walls closing in. "Damn it," she muttered, running a hand through her hair. Turning to Marcus, she spoke quickly. "I need your help. If you have any ideas on how to de-escalate this, now's the time." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a glint of defiance in his eyes. "De-escalate?" he repeated. "The only way to calm that crowd is to show them that their voices matter. That means accountability. That means transparency." Carson's mind raced. She had never been in a situation like this, caught between the demands of her superiors and the undeniable truth that Marcus represented. She knew that whatever decision she made next could change everything. "Fine," she said, her voice resolute. "We'll do it your way, but this had better work." Marcus nodded, a flicker of hope breaking through the storm in his eyes. "It's not about whether it works for you," he said. "It's about whether it's right for all of us." The atmosphere in the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center was suffocating, tension thick enough to slice through. Lieutenant Emily Carson stood in the hallway, her mind racing as she tried to process Marcus Grant's words. The crowd outside was restless, demanding action. Reporters buzzed around like a swarm, their cameras and microphones capturing every angle, every shout of indignation. Carson took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. If she was going to take Marcus's advice and do this the right way, she would need all the support she could get. But even as she prepared to act, doubts crept in. Would the department survive the fallout? Would she? Turning to Officer Jackson, she spoke with renewed determination. "Jackson, gather the senior officers. We need to address this head-on." Jackson hesitated, his eyes betraying the uncertainty that had gripped him since the morning. But he nodded, recognizing the gravity of the situation. "Yes, Lieutenant," he said, hurrying off. In Carson's office, Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked on hers. "This can't be just another cover-up," he warned. "People are tired of empty promises. They need to see that change is possible, and they need to see it now." Carson felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had joined the force with the hope of making a difference, of being part of a solution. But now, faced with the reality of systemic flaws and the broken trust of an entire community, she knew that platitudes wouldn't cut it. Before she could respond, the sound of a loud bang from outside jolted her. Her heart lurched as she rushed to the window. The crowd had surged forward, pressing against the barriers set up by the police. A young man, his face twisted with anger, had thrown a trash can lid at the station's front steps. Officers moved quickly to contain the situation, but the tension was palpable, ready to explode. Dr. Benjamin Howard, who had been addressing the crowd, raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Please," he called out, his voice deep and resonant, "let's not lose sight of what we're fighting for. Violence will only play into their hands." The crowd hesitated, the collective energy teetering on the brink. Aisha Robinson stepped forward, megaphone in hand, her voice cracking with emotion. "We are here for Marcus, for all of us who have faced injustice. We need to stay strong and united." Marcus heard the commotion through the thin walls of the station. The noise, the shouts, the desperation. It was like a physical force, a reminder of everything he had been fighting for. He knew the crowd was there for him, but he also knew how easily things could turn violent. The last thing he wanted was for his community to suffer more pain. He turned back to Carson, his voice steadier than he felt. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about the countless others who didn't have a crowd to speak for them. If we don't change things now, we never will." Carson felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to be the kind of officer who looked the other way, who perpetuated the cycle of mistrust. She nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I'm listening," she said. Moments later, Carson stood in the main briefing room, facing a gathering of senior officers. Officer Bradley and Officer Thompson sat stiffly, their eyes darting around the room, clearly uneasy. Chief Harold Morgan had arrived, his face flushed with frustration, but Carson didn't flinch. "Listen up," Carson began, her voice carrying over the low murmur of conversation. "We've got a situation outside that's about to explode, and it's because of us. We need to take responsibility, and we need to act fast." Chief Morgan's eyes narrowed. "And what do you suggest, Lieutenant? Appease the crowd and admit we were wrong?" Carson's gaze didn't waver. "Yes," she said firmly. "We have to be transparent. Marcus Grant was arrested without cause, and we owe him and the community an apology. We need to suspend Officers Bradley and Thompson pending a full investigation and show that we're willing to hold ourselves accountable." The room fell silent. Officers exchanged glances, some shocked, others angry. Bradley's face flushed red. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "We were following procedure." "No!" Marcus's voice rang out as he entered the room, escorted by Officer Jackson. The officers turned, some in surprise, others in defiance. Marcus's presence was commanding, his eyes unwavering. "What you did was abuse your authority," he said, his words cutting like a blade. "And it's that kind of behavior that erodes the very fabric of trust between law enforcement and the community." Bradley's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Marcus turned to the rest of the officers, his voice carrying the weight of every case he had ever fought. "This is bigger than me. It's about a system that has protected some at the expense of others. And if we don't face that truth, we're condemning ourselves to repeat the same mistakes." Carson's heart pounded. She knew Marcus was right, but admitting fault publicly was a risky move, one that could shake the department to its core. She glanced at Chief Morgan, whose face was a storm of conflicting emotions. Morgan finally spoke, his voice strained. "Fine. We'll do it your way, but know this, Carson. If this backfires, it's on you." Carson swallowed her fear and nodded. She knew the stakes, but she also knew that doing nothing would be even worse. Turning to Officer Jackson, she gave him a brief nod. "Bring the press inside. It's time we make a statement." Outside, the tension in the crowd was reaching a boiling point. Aisha Robinson clutched her megaphone, ready to speak again, when the station doors opened. The crowd fell silent, anticipation hanging in the air. Marcus emerged, flanked by Carson and Chief Morgan. Cameras clicked and reporters jostled for position, sensing a pivotal moment. Marcus stepped forward, his hands free now, but still carrying the invisible weight of what had happened. His voice was steady, but every word carried the depth of his pain and determination. "Today I stand here not just as a victim, but as a voice for everyone who has suffered at the hands of injustice," he began. "We cannot move forward without acknowledging the truth." The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus raised a hand and the noise quickly subsided. "This is not the end of the fight," he continued, "but it is a moment where we can choose a different path. We can choose accountability, transparency, and real change." Chief Morgan stepped forward, his expression solemn. "The Evergreen Police Department acknowledges the mistakes made today," he said, his voice heavy. "We are committed to a full investigation and to holding those responsible accountable." The crowd's reaction was a mixture of relief and skepticism. They had heard promises before, and words alone would not heal the wounds that had festered for years. But Marcus's presence, his unyielding determination, gave them hope. As the press conference ended, Marcus turned to Carson. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. Carson met his gaze, a newfound respect in her eyes. "I know," she replied, "and I'm ready." The scene outside the station began to shift. The crowd, though still restless, had found a glimmer of hope. People hugged, some cried, others held their signs higher, determined to keep pushing forward. But everyone knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. As Marcus looked out at his community, he felt a surge of resolve. The fight for justice was far from over, but he had never been more certain that it was worth every battle. The crowd outside the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center gradually thinned as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. The protests had calmed, but the tension remained, like the low hum of an approaching storm. Marcus Grant stood at the steps of the station, watching the faces of people he had fought for, people who had stood beside him in his pursuit of justice. He felt the weight of their hope pressing on him, a burden and a blessing all at once. Turning to Lieutenant Emily Carson, he gave a nod. "We've taken the first step," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Now we have to make sure it means something." Carson looked at him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and newfound purpose. "I'm with you," she replied. "But you know this won't be easy." Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "I've never expected it to be." Back inside the station, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Chief Harold Morgan stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the frustration boiling over. The press conference had been necessary, but it had left the department exposed. His phone vibrated incessantly with messages from city officials, and he knew that the fallout from this incident was only beginning. Officer Bradley paced the hallway, his face flushed with anger. He had felt humiliated, dragged through the mud in front of his colleagues and the public. Spotting Officer Thompson, he hissed under his breath, "This is a joke. We're being thrown under the bus for doing our damn jobs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, the earlier bravado gone. Maybe we did cross a line, he mumbled, but the words felt hollow. Bradley's eyes narrowed, his fist clenching. Don't start with that, he snapped. We were right, and you know it. In the midst of this tension, Officer Jackson was having a different struggle. He leaned against his locker, his head bowed. The events of the day played in his mind on a loop. The injustice he had witnessed, the courage it had taken Marcus to stand his ground. Jackson had joined the force to make a difference, but now he questioned whether he had the strength to fight the rot from within. As if reading his mind, Dr. Benjamin Howard appeared at the entrance of the station, his presence commanding yet calm. He had come to speak with Carson and Marcus, but first he caught Jackson's eye. The young officer straightened, his uncertainty etched across his face. You okay, son? Dr. Howard asked, his voice kind but probing. Jackson hesitated, then shook his head. No, sir, I'm not. None of this is right. Dr. Howard studied him, nodding slowly. Recognizing that is the first step, he said. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it? In a conference room, Marcus sat across from Carson and Dr. Howard, the gravity of their conversation palpable. We need to make a plan, Marcus began, his voice measured but urgent. The community needs more than promises. They need to see real, tangible change. Carson leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together. I've been thinking, she said, about creating a community oversight board, something to hold us accountable, to make sure incidents like this are handled transparently. Dr. Howard's eyes lit up with approval. That's a start, he said. But we also need to address training, the way officers are taught to interact with people in this community. The room fell silent for a moment, each person contemplating the enormity of the task ahead. Marcus felt the familiar fire of determination burn in his chest. He had spent years fighting in courtrooms, but now the battle had come to his own neighborhood. As they discussed the logistics, a sense of unity began to form, fragile yet unbreakable. They were allies now, bound by the understanding that the fight for justice was not just Marcus's fight, but a collective struggle. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit corner of the city, whispers spread. A man in a dark suit sat in a small office, his face illuminated only by the glow of his computer screen. He had watched the footage of Marcus's arrest, read the headlines, and knew that something bigger was brewing. This man, Agent Kevin Ross, had been following Marcus Grant's career closely. Marcus had been a thorn in the side of corrupt institutions for years, and his current work was of particular interest. Agent Ross's phone buzzed, and he answered with a curt, "Ross here." A voice on the other end spoke rapidly, the words carrying a sense of urgency. Things are escalating faster than anticipated. We need to act before this situation gets out of hand. Ross leaned back, his expression thoughtful. I know, he replied, but we have to be smart. If we move too soon, we'll expose everything. The call ended, leaving the room silent once more. Ross knew that Marcus Grant wasn't just a civil rights attorney. He was a key player in a much larger game, and that game was about to reach a boiling point. The following day, Evergreen Heights was a city on edge. News stations covered the protests, the press conference, and Marcus Grant's role in exposing systemic corruption. The community was divided. Some stood behind the police, convinced that order needed to be maintained, while others demanded sweeping reforms. Aisha Robinson, undeterred by the chaos, organized another rally at Glenwood Cultural Center. People from all walks of life gathered, united by a shared sense of purpose. Aisha's voice trembled with emotion as she addressed the crowd. We are here because we believe in a better future, she declared. One where our children don't have to live in fear, where justice isn't just a word but a reality. The crowd erupted in applause, but the tension was still palpable. Marcus watched from the sidelines, feeling the weight of the community's expectations pressing down on him. He had always known that change came at a cost, but he hadn't anticipated how personal that cost would feel. Inside the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center, Carson called a meeting with Chief Morgan and other senior officers. The atmosphere was tense, each person carrying their own fears and doubts. Carson laid out her proposal for the Community Oversight Board, her voice steady despite the pushback. We can't afford to keep doing things the same way, she argued. We need to show the community that we're committed to change. Morgan rubbed his temples, the stress lines on his face deepening. And what if this board turns on us? He asked. What if it undermines everything we've built? Carson met his gaze, her own resolve unshaken. Then maybe we need to be willing to face that, she said, because the alternative is losing whatever trust we have left. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. It was a gamble, but one Carson knew they had to take. As evening fell, Marcus returned to his home, exhausted but unable to rest. He sat in his study, surrounded by case files and memories of battles fought and won. The door creaked open, and his mother stepped in, her face lined with worry. "Marcus," she said softly, sitting beside him, "you've carried this burden for so long. Don't forget to take care of yourself." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the sting of unshed tears. "I can't stop now, Mom," he whispered. "Not when so many people are counting on me." She took his hand, her grip firm and warm. "Just remember," she said, "that you're not alone. We're all in this together." He looked at her, the weight of his exhaustion tempered by her strength. In that moment, Marcus knew that the fight would continue, but he also knew that he wasn't fighting it alone. Part 5. Lines drawn, the morning air in Evergreen Heights was crisp, carrying the promise of a new day, yet weighted with the residue of tension that lingered in every street corner. Marcus Grant stood at his kitchen counter, staring into the black depths of his untouched coffee. Sleep had been elusive, and the memories of yesterday's events played over and over in his mind, each moment a reminder of the uphill battle he was facing. He knew that this was just the beginning, and that the stakes had never been higher. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Aisha Robinson. "Meeting at Glenwood Cultural Center. Urgent." Marcus sighed, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He grabbed his coat, determination sparking in his tired eyes. At the Glenwood Cultural Center, the community leaders had gathered. Aisha stood at the front, her passion unyielding even in the face of mounting pressure. Dr. Benjamin Howard was beside her, his calm demeanor a counterbalance to her fiery resolve. The room was filled with people, concerned residents, activists, and volunteers ready to fight for change. Marcus entered, and a hush fell over the crowd. His presence was magnetic, a beacon of hope for those who had felt powerless for far too long. Aisha wasted no time. "Marcus," she said, her voice strong, "we need a game plan. The oversight board is a good start, but we need to push for more. We need real systemic change." Dr. Howard nodded, his voice thoughtful but urgent. "We have an opportunity here," he said, "but we have to be strategic. If we're not careful, those in power will do everything they can to undermine our efforts." Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. "We need to keep the pressure on," he agreed, "but we also need to give the community a voice. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us." His words sent a ripple of determination through the crowd, a spark that caught fire. But even as the room buzzed with plans and ideas, Marcus felt a lingering sense of unease. He knew that change didn't come without resistance, and the forces working against them were already mobilizing. Meanwhile, back at the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center, Chief Harold Morgan sat in his office, his expression dark. The stress of the past few days had aged him, deepening the lines on his face. He had called an emergency meeting with a select group of senior officers, including Lieutenant Emily Carson and Officer Bradley. The air crackled with tension as they gathered. Morgan's voice was cold, his words deliberate. "We're under siege," he began. "The community is rallying behind Marcus Grant, and the media has painted us as the villains. We need to regain control of the narrative." Bradley leaned forward, his face twisted with barely concealed rage. "We shouldn't be bending over backward for them," he spat. "We were doing our jobs." Carson shot him a glare, her patience wearing thin. "Your job was an abuse of power," she countered. "And now we're dealing with the consequences." Morgan held up a hand, silencing the argument. "Enough," he commanded. He turned to Carson, his eyes narrowing. "You've been pushing for transparency, and I get it. But if we don't play our cards right, we're going to lose everything." Carson felt her resolve waver, but she knew she couldn't back down. "We need to do what's right," she insisted. If we don't, we're just proving Marcus and the community right about everything they're fighting against. The room fell silent, each person lost in their own calculations and fears. Morgan leaned back, his mind racing. He knew that Carson was right, but his instincts as a career cop screamed at him to protect his own. It was a fine line he was walking, and one misstep could bring the entire department crashing down. As Marcus and his allies planned their next moves, a storm was brewing just out of sight. In the dimly lit office of Agent Kevin Ross, files were being scrutinized and strategies developed. Ross knew that Marcus Grant was more than just a civil rights attorney. He was a catalyst, a man who could ignite a revolution. And revolutions, in Ross's experience, were dangerous things. Ross's phone rang, and he answered with a curt, "Go ahead." A voice on the other end gave a quick update. "The pressure is building, sir. If we don't intervene soon, we'll lose control of the situation." Ross's eyes narrowed. "We don't make a move until we have all the pieces in place," he replied. "This isn't just about Marcus Grant. It's about the entire system. And if we play this right, we can reshape it." He hung up, his mind spinning with possibilities. Marcus's fight for justice had become a chess game, one where every move mattered, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of Evergreen Heights. That night, Marcus found himself standing on his balcony, looking out at the city he loved. The lights of Evergreen Heights twinkled, but the beauty of the view felt hollow. His mother joined him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're doing good work, Marcus," she said softly. "But don't forget to take care of yourself." Marcus turned to her, the weariness in his eyes evident. "I'm trying, Mom," he whispered. "But sometimes it feels like the world is against us." She squeezed his shoulder, her voice firm yet full of love. "Then let the world know who you are. Let them see your strength." Marcus nodded, the fire in his heart reigniting. He knew the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, but he also knew that he had a community behind him. And with that knowledge, he was ready to face whatever came next. The air inside Evergreen Law Enforcement Center was thick with tension, each breath an effort as conversations crackled with urgency. Lieutenant Emily Carson paced her office, the weight of the past few days pressing heavily on her shoulders. Outside her door, the station buzzed with a strained, uneasy energy, officers whispering in corners, phones ringing off the hook with inquiries from the media, and the ever-present pulse of the community demanding accountability. Carson's phone vibrated, and she picked it up to see a text from Marcus Grant. "We need to meet. Time is running out." Her fingers tightened around the phone. Time wasn't just running out, it felt like it was slipping through her grasp, each moment bringing them closer to a potential breaking point. She made a decision. Grabbing her jacket, she stepped into the hallway and motioned to Officer Jackson, who had been watching her with worried eyes. "You're coming with me," she said, her voice steady but urgent. Jackson nodded, falling into step beside her. Across town, Marcus waited at the Glenwood Cultural Center, the very heart of the community's resistance and hope. The room was alive with the hum of conversations, people discussing their next moves, strategies, and what they hoped the future might bring. Aisha Robinson stood by his side, her expression determined. "Marcus," she said, "they're scared, and they should be. But fear won't win this fight. We have to stay focused." Marcus nodded, his jaw set with resolve. "I know," he replied, "but we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." The doors to the center swung open, and in walked Carson, her expression unreadable. Officer Jackson trailed behind her, looking more like a man struggling to reconcile his own conscience than a figure of authority. The room fell silent as Carson approached, every eye fixed on her. Carson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on her. "Marcus," she began, her voice echoing in the room, "we need to talk. But more than that, we need to work together." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but he gestured for her to sit. "We've been talking for years, Lieutenant," he said, a hint of frustration in his voice. "It's time for action." Carson didn't flinch. "I agree," she said. "That's why I'm here. We're establishing the community oversight board you proposed. But that's only a start. We need more." The tension in the room shifted, the crowd leaning in as hope flickered. But Marcus, ever cautious, studied Carson. "And what's the catch?" he asked. Carson's gaze met his, unwavering. "The catch is that we're going to face backlash, from within the department, from city officials, and from people who don't want to see change. But I'm willing to stand with you, if you're willing to work with us." A murmur rippled through the room. Aisha stepped forward, her eyes fierce. "Words are cheap, Lieutenant," she said. "How do we know this isn't just another promise?" Carson turned to face Aisha. "Because I'm risking my career," she replied. "I'm risking everything I've worked for to make sure this happens. I don't have all the answers, but I'm here because I believe this is the right thing to do." The room fell silent, and for a moment it felt as though the world held its breath. Marcus studied Carson, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, the weight of her own struggle. Slowly he nodded. "Then let's get to work," he said, extending his hand. Carson took it, the handshake carrying the weight of a shared mission. It was a fragile alliance, but it was a start. Back at Evergreen Law Enforcement Center, Chief Harold Morgan watched the news coverage of the rally, his jaw clenched tight. The pressure was mounting, and he knew that the choices he made now would define his legacy. The old ways were crumbling, but the path forward was filled with uncertainty. He picked up his phone and made a call. "We need to prepare," he said into the receiver, his voice cold and steady. "This situation isn't going away, and I won't let this department fall apart." The city of Evergreen Heights braced itself as night fell. Streetlights cast long shadows, and the air buzzed with anticipation, as if the city itself knew that the battle for justice was far from over. Marcus stood on the steps of the Glenwood Cultural Center, looking out at his community. He could see the hope in their eyes, the fear, the exhaustion, and the determination. "We're not done," he whispered to himself, a promise as much as a declaration. And he knew, deep in his soul, that no matter what came next, they would face it together. As the early morning fog blanketed Evergreen Heights, Marcus Grant found himself back at the Glenwood Cultural Center, surrounded by community members who had arrived despite the chill in the air. The energy in the room was a complex blend of hope, determination, and lingering fear. People had come with questions, demands, and a fierce desire for change. Marcus stood at the center of the gathering, his presence commanding yet approachable. "We have an opportunity here," he began, his voice calm but charged with purpose. "But we also have a responsibility. We can't let the momentum slip away." Aisha Robinson stepped up beside him, her megaphone hanging from her shoulder. "We've made noise," she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "But now it's time to make progress." Before they could continue, a man stepped forward from the back, his expression guarded but earnest. It was Officer Jackson, his uniform pressed but his face etched with uncertainty. The room fell silent, tension rippling through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others glared at him, their distrust palpable. Jackson cleared his throat. "I know I'm not welcome here," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "And I get it. But I'm here because I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." He looked directly at Marcus. "You spoke about accountability, about change from within. I want to help make that happen." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some were skeptical, others cautiously optimistic. Marcus watched Jackson closely, searching his face for sincerity. He knew that trust was not given easily, and forgiveness was even harder to earn. Marcus took a step forward. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why now?" Jackson's hands clenched at his sides, his voice growing stronger. "Because I became a cop to protect people, not to hurt them, and because I'm tired of standing by and watching things happen that I know are wrong. If I'm going to wear this badge, I want it to mean something." The room held its breath, and Marcus felt a spark of something he hadn't expected, a glimmer of hope. He knew that real change required allies, even from unlikely places, but he also knew that words would have to be backed by action. "Then prove it," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "Show us that you're willing to stand up, even when it's hard, because that's what it's going to take." Jackson nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I will," he promised. Back at the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center, Chief Harold Morgan was meeting with a group of city officials, their faces pinched with worry. The pressure had become insurmountable, and the entire department was under scrutiny. Morgan's voice was calm but firm as he outlined the department's next steps, carefully crafted to protect their interests while attempting to appease the public. Lieutenant Carson's oversight board proposal is gaining traction, Morgan admitted, but we need to control the narrative. If we let this spiral, we're finished. One of the city officials, a man named Thomas Greer, leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "You need to understand, Harold," he said, his voice low, "that this isn't just about one arrest. It's about years of mistrust. If you want to save this department, you're going to have to make concessions. Real ones." Morgan's jaw tightened, but he nodded, knowing Greer was right. "I'll talk to Carson," he said. "But if this blows up in our faces, we'll be the ones left picking up the pieces." Meanwhile, Marcus sat in a small room at the cultural center, his head in his hands. The weight of the movement he was leading pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting. He had fought many battles, but this one felt different. It felt personal. Dr. Benjamin Howard entered, his presence calming. "Marcus," he said gently, "you can't carry this burden alone." Marcus looked up, his eyes tired but resolute. "I know," he whispered, "but if we fail, it's not just my burden. It's everyone's." Howard placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's why we're here, to fight together. Remember that." Marcus nodded, drawing strength from his friend's words. But even as he tried to believe in their collective power, he couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was still on the horizon. At the same time, Agent Kevin Ross sat in his dimly lit office, documents spread out before him. Each piece of paper, each photo, painted a damning picture of systemic issues within Evergreen's institutions. Ross knew that Marcus Grant's efforts were just the beginning and that the pressure building in the community was about to explode in ways no one could fully anticipate. His phone buzzed with a new message. "They're mobilizing. Be ready." Ross's eyes narrowed, a mixture of anticipation and dread settling in his gut. He knew that the forces at play were far more complex than they appeared, and the next moves in this high-stakes game would be critical. With a sigh, Ross leaned back, contemplating his role in the unfolding drama. He had watched men like Marcus before, fighters, disruptors, changemakers, and he had learned that those who sought to change the system often became targets of it. Night fell over Evergreen Heights, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Marcus stood on the balcony of his modest home, looking out at the neighborhood he loved. Streetlights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of past injustices. His phone buzzed with messages of support, but also threats, reminders that his fight for justice made him a polarizing figure. His mother joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You're doing good work, Marcus," she said softly, her voice carrying both pride and fear. "But be careful." He nodded, feeling the weight of her worry. "I will," he promised, though he knew the road ahead would be treacherous. The cost of change was steep, and the enemies he faced were both visible and hidden in the shadows. As the city slept fitfully, tensions continued to simmer, waiting for the inevitable spark. Marcus, Carson, Jackson, Aisha, and the entire community stood at a crossroads, each of them bracing for what would come next. The lines had been drawn, and the fight for Evergreen Heights had only just begun. The following morning, Evergreen Heights woke to a city still on edge. News outlets replayed footage of the protests and statements from community leaders, dissecting every word, every gesture, as if the fate of the city could be read between the lines. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if even the sky knew that something was about to break. At the Glenwood Cultural Center, Marcus Grant stood before a group of volunteers and community leaders, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to prepare," he said. "We've come too far to be caught off guard now." Aisha Robinson nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. "We're ready," she declared. "We've organized neighborhood watch groups, and the youth center has become a hub for resources and information. If they try to silence us, we'll only get louder." Dr. Benjamin Howard, who had become a steady presence in the movement, added, "Our greatest strength is our unity. We need to keep reminding people of that. Together, we're unbreakable." But even as they spoke of hope and resilience, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that shadows were closing in around them. The threats he had received weren't just idle words, they were warnings of the lengths some would go to maintain their grip on power. Lieutenant Emily Carson, back at the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center, was deep in conversation with Officer Jackson. The young officer's resolve had solidified overnight, and he had approached Carson with an idea that had been gnawing at him. "Lieutenant," Jackson began, his voice tight with determination, "we need to do more than just create an oversight board. We need to dig into our own records, cases that were mishandled, complaints that were buried. We need to shine a light on the dark corners." Carson studied him, her mind racing. It was a dangerous proposition. Exposing corruption from within could mean dismantling everything they knew, but it could also be the key to rebuilding trust. "Do you realize what you're suggesting?" she asked, her voice low. Jackson nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yes, ma'am, and I'm ready to face the consequences." Carson exhaled, feeling the weight of the choice before her. It was a gamble, but perhaps it was the only way forward. "All right," she said finally, "let's do it." Elsewhere, Agent Kevin Ross was on the move. The investigation he had been quietly conducting had reached a critical point, and he knew that Marcus's fight was about to intersect with something much larger. Ross's steps were quick as he entered a nondescript building in the heart of the city. He was met by a small team, each member as serious and focused as he was. "Status?" Ross demanded, his voice clipped. One of the agents, a woman with sharp eyes, replied, "We've traced the connections. Corruption isn't just local, it's part of a larger network. Marcus Grant's work is exposing more than just police misconduct. It's revealing ties to powerful interests who have a lot to lose." Ross's jaw tightened. He had expected resistance, but the scope of what they were up against was staggering. "We need to move carefully," he said. "One wrong step, and this city will erupt." The team exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew that time was running out, and the consequences of failure would be devastating. Marcus returned home that evening, his exhaustion palpable. He had been fighting for so long that the weight of it felt bone deep. His mother, ever his anchor, greeted him with a warm but worried smile. "Marcus," she said softly, placing a hand on his cheek, "you can't pour from an empty cup. Promise me you'll rest, even if just for a moment." He nodded, though he knew rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Still, he allowed himself a moment to sit on the porch, the night air cool against his skin. The stars above seemed impossibly distant, as if they were watching a drama unfold that was far bigger than any one man. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Carson. "We're digging deeper. It's riskier than ever, but it might be our only chance. Be careful." Marcus closed his eyes, a sense of foreboding washing over him. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. He knew that the coming days would test them all, pushing them to the very brink. But he also knew that he couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. The streets of Evergreen Heights pulsed with a restless energy as night fell. The city, once known for its quiet charm, had become a battleground for change. Tensions between the community and law enforcement had reached a fever pitch, and the air crackled with anticipation, like a storm waiting to break. Marcus Grant stood at the front of a packed community meeting at Glenwood Cultural Center, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. The room was full, men, women, young activists, and weary elders who had lived through their own battles for justice. Marcus's voice, though calm, held a fiery resolve. "Evergreen Heights has always been our home," he declared, "but a home should be a place where we feel safe, where we are treated with respect. Today, we stand at a crossroads, and the choice we make will define our future." The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus knew the applause wasn't enough. The people needed more than words. They needed action, results, and proof that their fight was making a difference. In a corner of the room, Aisha Robinson observed Marcus with a mixture of pride and concern. She had stood beside him through every setback, but even she couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on him. As the crowd settled, she stepped forward and took the mic. "Marcus is right," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "But this fight isn't his alone. It's ours. We need to support each other, protect each other, and make sure that the world hears us." Meanwhile, at the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center, Lieutenant Emily Carson sat at her desk, poring over files that painted a damning picture of the department's past. Cases of misconduct that had been brushed under the rug, complaints that had been conveniently forgotten. Each page she turned felt like a betrayal, a stark reminder of the rot she had promised to root out. Officer Jackson stood beside her, his eyes wide as he processed the information. "I had no idea it was this bad," he murmured. Carson looked up, her gaze hard and unyielding. "Most of us didn't," she replied. "But now we do, and we can't pretend we don't." Jackson swallowed, a knot of fear forming in his stomach. "If we bring this to light, it's going to destroy people's careers. It might even take down the whole department." Carson leaned back, her exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Then so be it," she said. "If we want to build something better, we have to be willing to tear down what's broken." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Chief Harold Morgan entered, his expression grim. He looked between Carson and Jackson, the tension in the room thickening. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Carson didn't flinch. "We're doing what we should have done a long time ago," she said. "We're exposing the truth." Morgan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Marcus could see the battle raging within him. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "You're playing with fire." Carson stood, her resolve unbreakable. "And maybe that's what we need," she replied. "To burn away what's corrupt so something new can grow." Back at Glenwood Cultural Center, the meeting had shifted to a strategy session. People threw out ideas, some bold, others desperate. Dr. Benjamin Howard, ever the voice of reason, tried to channel the energy into something productive. "We need to keep the focus on accountability," he said. "We can't let our message get drowned out by chaos." A young man stood, his face flushed with anger. "But what if accountability isn't enough?" he demanded. "What if we need to take things into our own hands?" Marcus stepped forward, his heart pounding. He had been here before, standing at the edge of a line he couldn't afford to cross. "Violence will only hurt us," he said, his voice firm. "We need to be strategic, not reactionary. This fight isn't just about today, it's about the future." The young man's shoulders slumped, but Marcus could see the frustration simmering beneath the surface. He knew that the anger was justified, but it was also dangerous. If it erupted, it could set back everything they had fought for. Aisha placed a hand on Marcus's arm, her touch grounding him. "We're with you," she whispered, "but we need to be ready for whatever comes." As the meeting broke up, Marcus stepped outside into the cool night air, his breath visible in the crisp chill. He leaned against the brick wall, his exhaustion catching up to him. The fight for justice was never ending, and he felt the weight of every life that had been touched by the struggle. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Agent Kevin Ross. "We need to talk. Urgent." Marcus frowned, the unease he had felt for days intensifying. Ross had been watching from the sidelines, and Marcus knew that his involvement meant something bigger was at play. He typed a quick reply. "Where?" Ross's response was swift. "My office." "Now." Marcus pushed off the wall, the sense of foreboding wrapping around him like a second skin. As he made his way to Ross's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm they had been bracing for was about to break. At the nondescript building where Ross operated, Marcus arrived to find the agent waiting for him, his expression unreadable. The room was dimly lit, shadows dancing along the walls. "What's going on?" Marcus demanded. Ross's jaw tightened. "We're in deeper than we thought," he said. "The corruption we've uncovered isn't just local. It's connected to a network that stretches far beyond Evergreen Heights." Marcus's heart pounded. "What does that mean for us?" Ross stepped closer, his voice low. "It means you need to be careful. There are people who will do whatever it takes to protect their interests. And if you keep pushing, you'll be putting a target on your back." Marcus clenched his fists, the fear and determination swirling within him. "Then let them come," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not backing down." Ross's eyes narrowed, respect flickering in his gaze. "I figured you'd say that," he said. "Just know that you're not alone. But tread carefully, Marcus. This fight is bigger than either of us." As Marcus left Ross's office and stepped back into the night, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The fight was no longer just about Evergreen Heights. It was a battle against a system that had thrived in the shadows for too long. And as he walked back into the heart of the city, he knew that the storm was coming, and they would have to weather it together. The city of Evergreen Heights awoke to a gray, overcast sky. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Marcus Grant stood outside the Glenwood Cultural Center, surrounded by community members who had gathered despite the morning chill. Faces of young activists, weary elders, and hopeful families filled the space, united by the fight they had chosen to carry on. Marcus took the stage, his voice steady but charged with emotion. We've faced pain, fear, and injustice, but we've also found something unbreakable: each other. We are fighting for a future where every person is treated with dignity. The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus knew it would take more than words. They needed results. They needed proof that change was possible. Aisha Robinson stepped forward, her eyes fierce. "We can't let up now," she declared. "The world is watching, but more importantly, our children are watching." Meanwhile, at the Evergreen Law Enforcement Center, Lieutenant Emily Carson was preparing to present the findings from the internal investigation. Staring at the thick file of corruption cases that had been buried for years, she felt a fire in her chest. Officer Jackson, standing beside her, looked apprehensive. "This could dismantle everything," he whispered. Carson's voice was firm. "If we want to rebuild, we have to be willing to start over." As she prepared to face the senior officers, she knew that the road ahead would be fraught with resistance, but it was a risk she was ready to take. Chief Harold Morgan, watching from the back of the room, knew that Carson's crusade was necessary, even if it left him wrestling with his own complicity. "Take it to the board," he finally said, his voice weary. "Let the chips fall where they may." At the Glenwood Cultural Center, Marcus and the community discussed strategies to keep the movement alive. Dr. Benjamin Howard emphasized the need for peaceful action, but a young man in the crowd couldn't hide his frustration. "What if peace isn't enough?" he demanded. Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm yet unyielding. "Violence will only hurt us," he said. "We need to be strategic. Our strength is our unity and our commitment to justice." The young man's anger softened, but Marcus could see the desperation in his eyes. This was a struggle for the future, and the pressure was mounting. Aisha placed a comforting hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We're with you," she said softly, "no matter how hard it gets." Later that day, Marcus received an urgent message from Agent Kevin Ross. "Meet me. We have to talk." The air felt colder as Marcus arrived at Ross's office, the shadows long and foreboding. Ross's expression was grave. "The corruption you've uncovered isn't just local," he explained. "It's tied to powerful interests. You're in more danger than you realize." Marcus felt the weight of the warning, but met Ross's gaze with unwavering resolve. "I'm not backing down," he said. "Evergreen Heights deserves better." Ross's eyes flickered with admiration. "Then be careful," he replied. "The fight is bigger than you, but you're not alone." As Marcus left Ross's office, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the gray clouds, casting a hopeful light over the city. Back home, his mother was waiting for him on the porch. She pulled him into a warm embrace, her eyes shimmering with pride and worry. "You've done so much, Marcus," she whispered, "but don't forget to rest." He nodded, feeling the exhaustion, but also the strength of the love surrounding him. "I will, Mom," he promised. The fight was far from over, but they had come this far together. The city of Evergreen Heights had been forever changed. Lieutenant Carson began implementing the oversight reforms, determined to hold the department accountable. Aisha continued to inspire youth, and Dr. Howard worked tirelessly to address deeper systemic issues. The community, though scarred, had chosen hope over fear. And Marcus? He stood at the heart of it all, a beacon of resilience, knowing that as long as they fought together, a brighter future was within reach. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and open the mind. Until next time, remember, every story has the power to make a difference, yours included.